So thanks everybody for coming, and I would like to present some research that we've been doing as a team. You can see the names there, and Jared is going to be presenting as part of this as well. This is a research project that has incorporated the voices of multiple disciplines. We have English, geography, science, and maths and technology. So we're looking at a framework to inform out-of-field teacher expertise, specifically looking at disciplinary ways of knowing, doing, and being. Just to begin with, teaching out of field, it's an issue that centres on the discipline and its relationship to the school subject, and how teachers are enculturated or exposed to those disciplines, because that's what determines whether they're in field and out of field. Obviously, in terms of teaching more broadly, you've got generic elements of practice, but there's also those subject-specific elements of practice, some of which are translatable into other subjects, because through reflection on practice and thinking about how you can bring ideas across from your in-field to your out-of-field, and some that are just directly transferable, just because they're core to teaching. And so the question that we pose is, what do secondary teachers need to learn when teaching a new subject? Some early research that me and some colleagues did identified that, yes, you've got new subject matter that teachers need to understand, and new teaching strategies, but there's also understanding how students behave and learn across different subjects. You begin to see that when you teach subjects that you wouldn't normally teach. Also, how to make the content relevant, knowing those stories of the subject, translation of those in-field practices and to out-of-field, and vice versa. But also teachers can develop an appreciation for what other teachers do. And as they learn to teach, they also look at what forms of support might be available within and outside of the school that they may not have been aware of before. And then at the core, and in terms of identity, you're looking at how to remain a passionate teacher despite of or because of teaching out of field, depending on how the teacher orients themselves to that out of field load. So with our subject, we're using two constructs. One is the disciplines, notion of discipline, and the other is signature pedagogies. So beginning with the disciplines, I've looked back at Joseph Schwab, who in this book here talks about the structure of the disciplines. And back in the day, they were looking at some of those core curriculum issues, which I think we still face now. It's through the limiting and distorting lenses of these bodies of knowledge that we look at things, in recognition that what you know actually enables, or that the discipline itself determines what you see and how you frame your experience. So the problems with the structure of the discipline that you're dealing with is the problem of organisation of this discipline. So how many are there? What are they? How do they relate to one another? Also looking at the conceptual structures that compose those different disciplines, and then the problem of syntax of each discipline. So what its canons and of evidence and proof are, how well they can be applied, etc. And as part of this project of multiple disciplinary experts coming together, we interrogated the next quote, for to know what structures underlie a given body of knowledge is to know what problems we shall face in imparting this knowledge. And it wasn't a straightforward answer when you look at even that quote from different disciplinary backgrounds. The notion of imparting, for example, was quite controversial for some. And I thought this study was really relevant by Middendorf and Pace, who was wanting to look at the disciplinary ways of thinking and differentiate them. And so in order to notice things about their own disciplinary ways of thinking, they placed fellows from disciplines at university into classes that were as far removed from their own specialty as possible, so that it would prompt them to rethink and look at their own practice through a new lens. So we'd say that similarly, out-of-field teachers are placed into situations that highlight the differences between the familiar and the unfamiliar as well. Maybe they see things about their own practice that they may not have noticed. And as a research team, we're also placing ourselves in this position in this study as we talk about our different disciplinary practices and ways of doing and being. Anyway, so the next framework is signature pedagogies, which comes into that notion of knowing, doing, and being, which was in the title. So signature pedagogies was framed by Schulman in 2005, looking at how you prepare people for disciplinary practice through their education. McLean's studies talking about that from the perspective of technology education, but Schulman presents a framework with flexible boundaries for educators to engage with disciplinary pedagogical routines to understand and promote, but also to challenge and change them, which is really important. So in terms of what signature pedagogies provides, it enables us to look at the subject-specific ways of knowing, including those knowledge and expertise, the doing in terms of practice, and the being, so acting, and that has an identity component as well. And that enables us to look at what an out-of-field teacher might need to learn in order to teach the subject. And so implicitly, says Schulman, they define what counts as knowledge in a field and how things become known. He proposed that there were surface, deep, and implicit structures. In the learning intentions are relating to that thinking, performing, and acting. And he talked about habits of mind, habits of hand, and habits of heart. In terms of translating that to teachers, teachers are enculturating their students into disciplinary ways of knowing, doing, and being of the subject. And teachers have some sort of appreciation of these, you would expect. So that's sort of the framing of our theoretical approach. What we're doing is a collaborative and interdisciplinary research. We are teacher educators from different disciplines, and we're generating a framework of subject-specific expertise for out-of-field teachers that we hope is translatable across disciplines. The research questions that we're looking at, the main one is what's core to teaching a subject. And in looking at that, thinking about what's subject-specific and what's common. How does the experience of teaching out-of-field in one subject differ to teaching out-of-field in another? And how does this relate to the subject teaching expertise needed? So these are core questions that sort of sit in the backdrop. In terms of the actual process of research, we are looking at, we're drawing in a collaborative and interdisciplinary research. So collaborative in that we're inviting dialogue between different disciplinary experts. The theory of collaborative advantage provides opportunity for joint working across disciplines to enhance our practical understanding, and our boundary crossing also recognises the educative nature of crossing boundaries through collaboration. And there's a quote there from a book chapter that is currently in press, where we talk about the methodology that we've taken. So we recount our methodological steps, illustrate the complexity of our interdisciplinary dialogue, and suggest how our collaboration has led to new understandings of teaching out of field to inform teacher professional development. So what we're going to present here is the outcome of, to date, of our of those collaborations. So just in terms of what we've done so far, we've identified the theories. We had deep collaborative discussions and documentation of key ideas initially to work out, how we would approach the problem. And then we identified possible elements of teacher expertise. And you see they've been separated out there into knowing, doing, and being. And for each of the subjects, we've documented what they mean for each of our subjects. And then in looking across those, working out what are the salient elements that we need to develop this framework that is supposedly translatable across subjects. So this is where we've got to. It's at the core of it is the teacher subject identity, but across it is the questions of what's distinctive about the subjects and what do out-of-field teachers need to know, do and be. All of it sitting within the context of the broader context of education and the disciplines, recognizing that even that in that space that there is contestation, it's constantly changing and it's influenced by that broader social, cultural and political forces. So in terms of the red and the purple regions, you've got sort of your left and your right. And we wanted to bring in the influence of discipline because we feel that that's essentially what out-of-field teachers have not been exposed to. So looking at what's the influence of having that disciplinary background. And we focused on 4 key areas. So how we inquire and generate knowledge, and the nature of that knowledge, knowing what is in the curriculum, what's missing and how it links to discipline, the notion of connections between the individual and the world, as well as connections between the knowledge within and across subjects, and then the pedagogical imperatives. So what I'm going to do now, the quote on the side from Collins Dictionary is quite helpful to think about what we mean by framework here. So it's a particular set of rules or ideas or beliefs that we want to use in some way to deal with problems. So I think that's quite a useful way of thinking about this framework in helping us to understand how we can support teachers with such a framework. So looking at the left side, it's almost like this is left brain and right brain. I didn't mean it that way, but it's sort of come that way. So in thinking about how we inquire and generate knowledge, we started thinking about the study of, and you can get this from Wikipedia, and then the modes of inquiry that actually define the discipline. And then thinking about how we inquire and generate knowledge, we were looking at different ways of making sense of the world, defining these differences, and how that places the cognitive demands on out-of-field teachers. And that ultimately different disciplines and their related subjects have different modalities or linguistically realised claims to truth. So when you start talking about inquiry, for example, the English person really had no idea what we're talking about, interestingly enough, modes of inquiry for generating knowledge. So science and maths, for example, can make strong claims to empirical evidence. So it makes sort of sense to talk about that. Whereas in English and arts, there's multiple answers, different notions of truth and knowledge. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Jared now for this one.
Perfect. Thanks, Linda. Good evening, colleagues. So Seamus, Susan and I worked on this part of this framework, which is the bottom left side there, around the knowledge for subject teaching and what knowledge is required for effective teaching and what this might mean for out-of-field teachers. And when we looked at this aspect of this framework, we looked at the nature of content knowledge into curriculum knowledge and also pedagogical content knowledge. And these 4 points are some of the key things that were jumping out at us from the literature and the work that we've done about recognising and understanding the grain size when we're talking about the knowledge that a teacher might have and being able to move seamlessly between them. So discipline, for example, science, into a subject like physics, a topic like mechanics, and into a concept like forces in motion or understanding balanced forces. So being able to move between those things as well as appreciating that idea of progression of learning and the complexity involved there. And that third point becomes really important, that recognising and understanding the difference between how progression of learning occurs between concepts and also how curriculum is developed and how curriculum is a quantized view of that. So it's taking chunks of information out, and for an out-of-field teacher, how they can work with those pieces of information versus an in-field teacher, how they'll think differently, which then leads into the last point there about PCK, how teachers can think about selecting appropriate concepts, how they can sequence ideas, what strategies they're using to elicit thinking and promote discussion, and varying those instructional practices. And like Linda signaled earlier, coming from different backgrounds, and this became really important about, for me, what's important coming from physics, to Seamus and chemistry and Susan geography, and then others as well having their input. So Linda, I'll throw back to you. I realise we're on the cusp of the time for the last little bit.
Yeah, okay, there. Thanks very much. So the right part of the framework we have yet to develop fully, but what's interesting is to look at the relational elements of what it means to know. The notion of I'm a scientist, what does that mean? Why writers write, why people become mathematicians. So that's something that's going to be really valuable to explore. And also thinking about learning through experience and the value of actually working with and working in and being part of that enculturated way of knowing, doing and being as well is really important. So the other two red parts, then you've got this notion of relevance, I think, that underpins the connection. The meaning of relevance is really complex and really subject specific. In terms of pedagogical imperatives, this was really interesting because we were all talking about misconceptions and the English person was going, I have no idea what you're talking about. Again, so it really challenged us to think about, okay, misconceptions or dealing with alternative conceptions and representation, it's all really important to some of these subjects, but what is it that overarches those things that are inclusive of those other things that English might be talking about, like the different paradigms that drive their practice? So that's why we're focusing on that notion of pedagogical imperatives. So in terms of where we go to here, we've developed the proposed framework and we're currently aligning it to the literature, and it will morph and shift as we do that. We're then going to interview some disciplinary experts and redefine the framework. But ultimately, this interdisciplinary collaborative inquiry really has been useful in finding those tacit things that we probably wouldn't have thought about, like misconceptions, like inquiry, and realising that they're actually not quite common, and that realising that these are discontinuities for out-of-field teachers, that we may assume that they understand these ideas, but actually it's very important to be explicit and to discuss those things. It has been a methodologically difficult at times, looking for those salient parts that are common or that provide a useful framework. But it is hoped that the framework that we develop can provide some support for teachers, in finding ways to navigate unfamiliar subjects in both rich and timely ways, recognising that being out of field actually can be discomforting, but it also does reap rewards. All right, so thank you. And that's the framework, if we want to have that there for discussion.